Hello! Today I'm concluding my recent look at Final Fantasy X with a discussion on the enigmatic but quietly significant character of Auron. Now, Auron stands out for a number of reasons and has persisted as a fan favourite over the years, owing to his reserved demeanour, his quiet mystique, and his generally strong design, which, coupled with his role in the story, makes him a standout inclusion to the world of Final Fantasy X, I think. And kicking off, firstly, with his design, because for me and many others, I think, it was one of the immediately intriguing things about him. It is, I suppose, an underpinning factor of the unique science fantasy aesthetic that Final Fantasy goes for, in the way that it combines different cultural elements and affectations to create something uniquely its own. And what I mean by that is, if we look at the peripherals of his attire, they comprise Western-style braces, pauldrons, belts and boots, which are accessorised with modern-looking sunglasses. But quite tellingly, his stylised overcoat is fashioned almost like a kimono, which is worn beneath his belts in the same way that the kimono is arranged with the sash. His sword is an abstracted, super-large katana, and he has a rather distinct Japanese-looking Takuri flask. So for all intents and purposes, Auron is fashioned after the quintessential real-world samurai, and indeed even his posture, with one arm slung inside his sleeve, has connotations which, for my part, I thought was a fictional stylisation of the samurai that I associate with movies like Yojimbo, but actually there are paintings and photographs of samurais wearing their kimonos this way, which many people put down to either ease of combat and ventilation. So the samurai vibe is strong with Auron, visually speaking, but it also synchronises in his demeanour, which is the stoic Confucian Buddhist reserve that's often associated with the samurai class. And I felt this combined really well to characterise him and his overall aesthetic. But beyond that, and beyond just this surface stuff, if we actually look at his role in the story as someone who knows more than he lets on, and from the outset appears as if from nowhere as this mysterious guide, I think these mysterious samurai elements work doubly well because they reinforce this mystique and unknowability of Auron. And if we account for the fact that he's, cloaked, he's wearing sunglasses and a high collar which obscures his features and his expressions, it all combines to present someone who is hiding something or knows something. So the aesthetic combined very well with his role in the story and created a very kind of distinct and standout character there. And just a final note on this, and something that I read not long ago, was that actually, in an early draft of the Final Fantasy X story, Auron, or the character that would become Auron, was going to be revealed as Tidus' father towards the end of the game. So, looking at the somewhat covetous and clandestine design of Auron, if that was indeed, the case for the story, we can see how that may have been applied, and this Darth Vader I am your father reveal moment might have happened. But personally speaking, I think they did well to separate it out, the entities of Auron and Jecht, and making Auron more of a surrogate father figure, and relegating Jecht for the climactic showdown with Sin, which reconciled that story. I think it was much stronger because Auron is a guardian who ushers Tidus through his journey and educates him. It was an excellent contrast to Tidus' relationship to Jecht, or lack thereof, and I think it quietly amplified the absence that was in Tidus' life there. And as I mentioned in my recent Sin discussion and the Final Fantasy X retrospective, I think the implications and the symbolism of Jecht as Sin was very strong, and unified this story, Tidus' personal arc with the wider whole, I think. So, moving on, beyond Auron's excellent design, which echoes his inherent mystery, let's look more closely at his role in the story. And of all the characters in Final Fantasy X, it's striking just how singular and important Auron is here. And I've jokingly suggested in the past that while people debate between who's the protagonist, between Tidus or Yuna, or whether it's both of them, I think looked at a certain way, Final Fantasy X is sort of like Auron's revenge tale against Yevon. Such is his centrality to bringing together all these people and events and facilitating this journey. And I'll unpack that shortly. And I suppose something I love about Final Fantasy stories is how they can be looked at any number of ways, and they take on a life of their own among fans in a lot of cases. But looking at Auron, and starting first with his initial role in the story, He's very in keeping with the hero's journey formula. He ushers Tidus from the known world into the unknown. He furnishes him with the first artifact, which is the longsword, and he very quickly assumes the mature mentorship role. But overlaid with this, we have the aforementioned mystery that's inherent to Auron, that makes him so intriguing, and only in retrospect a lot of these pieces fall into place for the player. For example, the opening cinematic, where we see Auron raising his flask in salute to the oncoming Sin, is a very potent yet ambiguous cinematic, because at that point we don't realise that Jecht is Sin, and it's only in retrospect that it actually makes sense as to why Auron would be kind of acknowledging this beast. Likewise, we have Auron introduced as someone who is known to Tidus, yet the nature of that relationship is ambiguous, and then later on we find out that he's also known to Yuna and the people of Spira. So it's doubly intriguing and confusing to the player, and one of those elements of Final Fantasy X's story that made it so compelling to play, to try and uncover the mysteries and the truths that kind of, a lot of which kind of root back to Auron. So Auron begins as the guide figure for Tidus, and much like the original Star Wars, which we know the Final Fantasy team loves to sort of parody and reference in a lot of places, the setup is such that Auron is known to Tidus in the same cursory, fleeting way that Obi-Wan Kenobi is known to Luke Skywalker. It's almost as if he's observing him from afar before bringing him to adventure, passing down the father's weapon and knowing the truth of the father's fate. So Auron and Obi-Wan are very kind of parallel in that respect. Once we arrive in Spira, Auron's role makes way for the romance angle to take hold between Tidus and Yuna, and the typical hero's journey begins to get subverted here, most symbolically I think by Tidus inheriting Chapu's brotherhood rather than persisting with a unique personal or inherited blade like many other fantasy media does. But back to Auron, he assumes mentorship or guardianship of both of our heroes here. He becomes an integral counterbalance to the youthful idealism of our young heroes with his sober observations and dry wit, and we learn that he's fulfilling a promise that's been made to both Yuna's father Braska and Tidus' father Jecht, which is why he's the primary steward of their journey. And I think this is where the true significance of Auron lies in the game, because he's a bridge between past and present. He's the bridge between Tidus and Yuna, and he's the architect of significant events, such as Yuna breaking away from the Summoner's Journey, and Tidus squaring up and finally facing his father. So Auron's centrality to the story and how he touches on so many of the events that transpire is interesting, and it can't be understated here. And this leads me on to my earlier point, which is, looked at a certain way, he could certainly be considered a more primary character than he's given credit for. And whether or not you consider it a revenge tale, he's certainly a bit of a covetous guy. He's a bit of a schemer. And to use a negative connotation, he's a manipulator of events. Because after all, he does have his own agenda, which is emphasised by the vendetta against the Church of Yevon. And we learn much later that he's embittered and vengeful about the death of his friends, and the fool's errand that is the Summoner's Journey, which also claimed his own life. But such is his will to remain in Spira and facilitate the downfall of the Church, and along with the faith bring about the destruction of sin. He remains an unsent, which I thought was a very powerful element of his character that isn't really commented upon. The fact he is unsent, he has persisted for this reason. So that was a very cool reveal in the endgame. And I was one of the few people that didn't pick up the hints throughout the game that he actually was unsent until it was actually outrightly stated. So that's the ulterior motive and the other side of Auron's personality. But while I say he is a covetous character, I don't mean that in a negative or antagonistic sense. And actually, if we take a step back from the macro story and look more closely at Tidus' personal story, some of the most moving scenes, or at least some of the most developmental scenes, particularly for Tidus, are these small moments in the game where the party kind of wanders off, they carry on, and they leave Tidus and Auron to converse together. And Auron reveals many anecdotes about his past, about Jecht, and in his own stoic way, he chips away to reframe the image of the father in Tidus' mind. So clearly, quite a compassionate character, and I found those moments between those two quite moving. And again, it kind of emphasises this idea that perhaps Auron is a surrogate kind of father-like figure for Tidus. Finally, I suppose there is Auron's own backstory, and as has long been renowned about Final Fantasy, it has a penchant for world building and giving us characters that have a wealth of depth and history to them that leave many fans to kind of speculate and wanting more from them, which is where suggestions of prequels and sequels come in that I've discussed quite recently. And Auron is no exception to this, and while we primarily see him in the contemporary events of the game as a wizened elder, which apparently for Squaresoft is the age of 35, through allusion and dialogue and flashbacks via the spheres, we piece together an image of a man who has undergone a monumental change in personality and critical change in his life. Because Auron begins as a devout Yevonite who, much like Wakka, has a very obvious intolerance to those who don't obey the teachings, as is witnessed by his interactions with Jecht. And he goes from this kind of blinkered, idealistic young man to someone who, through his gradual acceptance of Jecht and through his tribulations of life and his betrayals in life, such as the much alluded to discord between him and Maester Kinoc, and climactically, of course, the final summoning that kills his friends and also himself, he becomes a much more stoic and muted guardian for the next generation. And many to this end would say that Auron became a cynic, but I do contend that view, and while he's clearly dismissive of Yevon, I think he's actually an idealist. He's put into action a plan to change things and salvage Spira through the vehicle of Tidus and Yuna. So, vengeful, yes, perhaps. Cynical, maybe a little. But he's certainly a character that seeks to enact positive change upon the world in quite a conclusive way. And again, it is one of the many reasons that I hold Auron in quite high regard as a character. So, there's some brief thoughts on Auron, because of all of the accompanying party members who each have significant in their own way towards progressing the narrative and reflecting aspects of the setting and Yevon and the story, which I discussed recently, and actually a few comments made some very good points around the wider characters and how they reflect that. I felt Auron, among all of these, warranted discussion because he is such an integral linchpin between the events of the game. And while he is undoubtedly very cool looking aesthetically, and he's very cool gameplay wise, if you like those power characters, I think the way his story, within the story, is structured and quietly escalates is one of the standout elements of Final Fantasy X, and one of the brilliant mysteries that unravels over the course of Final Fantasy X. So, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts on Auron.